Hey everybody, welcome back to another video with Hail State Debate. Today we're going to be talking about the PF resolution, which is resolved in the United States. Right to work laws do more harm than good. And as always, everybody here is happy as ever to give you the expertise that you may need to help yourself in the debate round. Now, that being said, you might notice there's a lack of a familiar face around town, and that is Brett. You know, if you must know, he was drafted. I'm just kidding. But in all actuality, it's a lot of work to make these videos, and as you can imagine, going from one topic every 2 months to one topic every month, it might take on a little bit more work and effort to make these videos. But that being said, we're going to follow our general structure here, and we're going to go ahead and get on into our initial thoughts of this topic. Okay, so for our initial thoughts, we have two faces here with us today, along with me, Devin, if you might remember me from other videos. We've got Luke here, Luke Cheney, a very good policy debater from high school and an even better debater here in IPDA at Mississippi State University, and a great student, maybe a new face for you, Tanner, who's an agronomy student here at Mississippi State University and an even better addition to the team, and they're all going to give their ideas on what we think about the topic. So Tanner, since you're new, why don't you go ahead and go first?
So my general consensus on what this case is going to look like, what I can infer from the case is that the con will probably be running an argument centered around the freedom of the worker. And if they have the freedom to choose or not choose, and if we're forcing these workers to get in a union and forcing them to use money that they might not have, that's just unjust. I am really intrigued to see how debaters will take something like a union and kind of turn them as the enemy, because typically unions are like the hero to the big corporations. But here, the union's going to be viewed as the enemy if you're running it on that side. So it's going to be interesting to see how debaters are going to do that.
And what about you, Luke?
Well, first of all, this is a really specific, straightforward topic, which I really like. There are a lot of different iterations of right-to-work laws, but I mean, there's a general idea of what they are. So you're not going to see a whole lot of shady tactics or overly creative cases, as I like to think of them. And you're going to walk into the round and you are going to know exactly what's happening. And I can see a lot of logical and economic arguments being run on not just the pro, but also the con side as well. But like Tanner said, the con is going to have an extra kind of area to work with, which is worker freedom. And there are a lot of different ways you can go with that, which we'll get into later. But for now, again, I think that there's going to be even ground kind of on both sides to debate. It's pretty evenly matched. Although I will say that this whole unions being good or bad argument may not be the way to go. It could be a good strategy, but if your opponent's clever, they could manage to turn that entire argument on you. So just keep all of that in mind when you're writing your case. And what about you, Devin? What do you think? You know,
I would somewhat agree with that, but maybe I'm more of a cynic. I think this is a great topic, and it's a massive improvement from what we've seen from the NSDA and recent iterations of whatever they've thrown at you. I'm not personally, and I'm sure you've heard it a lot from this channel, a big fan of the topics that have come out of them. But with that being said, this is a relatively simple topic. Like Luke said, this isn't really going to be, really complex. The con or the pro, and sometimes we might not like this, don't have a lot of leeway in terms of going to this far-off region and talking about some crazy thing that we've never heard of or making a super clever and hyperbolic argument. It is going to be a very straightforward topic, but I think it's also going to be really, really lopsided in terms of the pro. The pro has a very huge advantage here, right? Because you're going to walk into a room, and I know a lot of PF debaters a lot of times have problems with the layness of our judges. You're going to walk into a room, and you're not going to be talking about West Asia. You're not going to be talking about China or India. You're going to be talking about something that people know everything about. The daily lives that they live, how much money they make, what the health care is that they have, the food that they can afford off of this wage or that wage. And the pro, which is entirely focused around and has much evidence to support the side about making more money or having this more benefit, whatever, has a huge advantage here when you're talking to people that live this life and that are going to be able to make this metric out in their own mind without having you explain it to them. With that being said, I do think this is going to be a super boring topic for the pro and for the con. I think this is just going to be the topic where you walk up there and the pro says, here's my statistic on you gaining X percentage point on an increase in your wages. And then the con will come up and say, actually that's not true, you get this increase, or actually maybe this decrease. It's going to be an evidentiary battle, it's going to be brutal, it's going to be fought in the trenches. And it's going to be boring. It's going to be really cut and dry if I'm honest with you. But that's the way I see it. Again, I think it's a great topic, but I think it's going to be really lopsided for the pro, and I think it's just going to be super boring for everyone there, even though it's easier. That being said, we're going to be giving you some hopefully very productive insight into these topics. And like I said at the top of the video, we're going to be doing our basic structure of definitions and framing, pro arguments, con arguments, and then we're going to give you some of our final thoughts. So now, on to the definitions and framing. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the definitions and framing. The first definition we're going to want to hit on is, of course, the subject of the debate, right to work laws. And right to work laws are a diverse set of laws, yes, depending on the state you are looking at. Maybe it's Mississippi, or if it's in Michigan or in Montana, you're going to have some differences in the laws, but principally speaking, they are all pretty much the same, at least in the sense that we know what their ostensive purpose is, and that is to limit the ability of unions to impose themselves on workers.
Brian, I mean, like I said earlier, this is such a simple, kind of streamlined topic that I think that this is a really good opportunity for all of you out there who haven't started writing your cases yet to really focus in on that and just focus in on finding some good data rather than getting bogged down in definitions.
There should still be some concern in the intricacy of how much people, that write on this issue are going to be fairly vague about this. Some, like I mentioned earlier, the AFL-CIO or the National Right to Work Legal Defense Fund, all of them are going to be fairly vague and fairly partisan, but just try to push over that, try to avoid that, and just try to find the right definition. That right definition, of course, is going to be, from what we've found, the Cornell Legal Information Institute, which says, quote, a state that has a law prohibiting union security agreements is a so-called right-to-work state. In these states, employees in unionized workplaces cannot negotiate employment contracts which require that all benefiting members contribute to the costs of the representation in negotiation. This means that an employee does not need to join a union and pay union dues to work for the company. The Taft-Hartley Act, enacted in 1947, outlawed closed shop laws, which allowed most states to pass right-to-work laws. As of 2020, there are 28 right-to-work states, mostly in the Midwest, South, and Mountain West. And yes, sure, that's fine in terms of, if you understand legalese, but in layman's terms, the simplest way to put this is these are laws designed to make sure that unions cannot make union security agreements. And what those are, essentially, again, according to the Cornell Legal Information Institute, a union security agreement is an agreement between a labor union and an employer that the employer will require all employees to undertake a specified level of support for the union as a condition of employment. This level of support compels employees to become members of the labor union before a certain period of time, generally 30 days, has elapsed, as well as make certain payments or agency fees to the union and initiation fees as a condition of getting or keeping the job.
Wow, that was a lot of legalese right there. So let's kind of break it down. In layman's terms, there was a law or a series of laws in the past that made union membership a condition of employment, which means that when you actually join up as an employee, you have to become a part of the union at that workplace. Now, what right-to-work laws do is make that union membership optional, and it also, a lot of the time, will make paying union dues optional if you're an employee at that workplace.
Now, one thing to point out is that it is not ensuring people work, all right? So the name is kind of misleading, but it does not ensure people work. It does not protect people to get a job or have a job. It is just said that it's called that to, I guess, trick people.
Right.
Yeah.
Like in other countries, you have these right-to-work laws wherein you have right-to-work programs, kind of like the New Deal worker program, where you just say, everybody's going to be given a job, or we're going to invest in roads and in bridges so that way people can get work. That's not what we're talking about. Nobody here is talking about investment programs or infrastructure programs. We're not opposed to that. But again, we're not arguing that. This is specifically about banning or prohibiting union security agreements.
Yeah, and then one other clarification. There is such thing as a right to work in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, meaning that it is your basic human right to have a job if you'd like one. That's also not what we're talking about, so don't get confused there either.
Yeah, so just keep in mind that this law, although it has a name that doesn't really mean what it is, just know what it is, explain it to your judge well, and just have your points following that.
That being said, let's go ahead and get into more harm than good. What do we mean when we say more harm than good? Are we talking about the consumers? Are we talking about the workers? Are we talking about society in general? The con, more than likely, is going to want to run society in general or consumers. because of course that can leave out the problem for workers. If we're not talking about workers, we don't have to talk about salaries. If we're not talking about workers, we don't have to talk about health benefits. If we're not talking about workers, we don't have to talk about any of these other things that are specifically good for workers. And we can focus on things like employment or cost of goods or other things that unions might really kind of try to shape. For instance, in the con economy, if you have right-to-work states, employment does go up because unions don't have to, force all of these people to join a union, and they don't collectively bargain for higher wages, which means that companies can hire more people if they are paying employees generally less money. So in general, this is where you're going to see a little bit of the difference in the debate. The pro is going to come up there, and you're hopefully going to want to say, I want to see a world where we're focusing on workers, and the con's going to say, I want to see a world where we're focusing on consumers or on the economy as a whole. That being said, I already know that some of you on the con are going to be thinking, well, I already got a great argument to run. Let's talk about worker freedom. How are we going to prioritize their freedom over their economic, benefits here? And I would say just stick to the script. Be very conservative. Don't stick your neck out. When we're talking about the economy and we're talking about these things, this is going to be a very quantifiable battle. Stick to the numbers. Don't try to argue things that you can't quantify. Don't try to argue things where, to be quite frank with you, worker freedom, I don't think, is more important, and your judge probably won't think this either, than being able to pay for your children to go see the doctor or being able to feed your children.
Right.
While employee freedom or employee satisfaction can be difficult to quantify, it's definitely not impossible. And in fact, during my research, I saw that a con case that focuses actually primarily on the workers themselves is not only viable, but it could be a really good strategy against a pro case that uses a lot of these statistics like Tanner and Devin have mentioned.
Yeah,
Right.
and another thing to add on y'all's thing is, and I said this in my intro, but I mean, to weight each argument, and we just kind of referred to that as some arguments have more weight than others, like your kid might get less education, or you can have more freedom in your workplace. Now there's some weight there, but you got to make sure to weigh all your arguments so that the judge knows how to vote on the ballot. Keep in control with that argument.
And so you can already tell if you're watching the video who's going to be representing which side in this debate. But that being said, I think we're going to let you do the arguing when it comes to these things, but we're just going to give you the arguments. So let's go ahead and get on to the pro arguments. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the pro. The first argument we're going to run on the pro is pretty simple. Unions are good and right-to-work laws are bad for them. Love them or hate them, unions are actually pretty good, and maybe I'm partial on this. I think that unions are pretty good in this country. I think that they do a lot for the workers, and I think that once you get into the case, it's not going to be really hard to sort of quantify this or really build a case out of unions being good, that they are empirically good. The problem is that right-to-work laws can often have a negative effect on these benefits. Underfunded unions aren't able to supply the same benefits to its members, and that can happen by having smaller unions or unions where many of the members don't pay the dues. Tanner, do you want to say something?
Right, yeah. I mean, the simplest way for the pro to go at this is that if we look at how the correlation is with healthcare, with education, with all these things in non-right-to-work law states and right-to-work law states, then we can obviously see that there is a distinction. Now, keep in mind that if you take, for example, like New Mexico and New York, two states that are completely contrary, two different areas, that's going to be really hard to compare. But if you do on the border, like a borderline, like some places in Michigan and Wisconsin, I think that they're different. But if you do it in such a way that they're in similar territories, similar economic pressures, that's going to make it much easier looking at the differences in healthcare and education, things like that.
So what exactly are the benefits? A report out in June 10th of 2022 from the Joint Economic Committee of the Senate says this: unionized workers get higher pay, better benefits, and more say over their work schedule compared to workers who are not in a union. For example, union workers earn an average of 10.2% more than their non-unionized peers, even when comparing workers with similar education, occupation, and experience levels. Unionized workers are more likely to have health insurance, and their employers pick up more of the costs. Workers who belong to a union are 18.3% more likely to have employer-sponsored health care compared with their non-union peers. Moreover, unionized workers employers pay 77.4% more per hour worked towards the cost of health insurance. Workers and unions have more control over their schedule. More than 3/4 of non-unionized workers do not get their work schedules more than a week in advance, and trust me, I will tell you, that is terrible. while more than 1/3 of unionized workers get it within at least a week's notice. Getting work schedules earlier allows workers to make arrangements, such as for child care, sufficiently far in advance to balance both work and care responsibilities. Unions provide major economic benefits for workers and families. There are broader spillover economic benefits for all workers in industries with high rates of unionization, even if individual workers are not themselves in a union. Unions set a standard for working conditions in industries in which they are prevalent. If employers have to compete for workers who have a good chance of getting a union job, non-union employers have to pay higher wages and offer better benefits to attract and retain workers. As a result, average wages are higher in highly unionized industries, even if a worker is not themselves in a union. The pay standards set, and I'm sorry, this is a huge mouthful, this whole quote, have weakened and wage inequality has worsened as the union membership has declined. According to research, the decline in organized labor explains 20% to 1/3 of the rise in wage inequality from 1973 to 2007. And it's not just union workers or even workers in heavily unionized industries who suffer when unions decline. Non-union workers also suffer because strong unions exert general upward pressure on wages across the entire economy. According to a study done by Tom Van Hoevelen, I suppose that's how you pronounce it, of the University of Illinois, they said that if labor unions had a stronger presence in the workplace, all workers would see bigger paychecks and better employee benefits. Quote, non-union workers would have seen 3% to 7% higher wage growth during their careers if U.S. labor unions were still strong. Even if they were not in the union themselves, if we were seeing 70s to 80s level union growth in terms of union membership or union density, you would see those people having higher wages themselves because, and this is a very simple economic argument, if one part of the industry is paying extremely high wages, they're going to attract all of the best workers, forcing all of the other firms in that industry to push up their wages as well to attract similar amounts of talent. It's a fairly supply and demand, simple argument for you guys to push forward. And so not only do unions provide benefits in the sense that they are going to push up industry wages or industry benefits, but their ability to provide these stems directly from their size. If a union is not large enough, it's not going to be able to provide these benefits on the scale that they are doing so. According to a study published in September 16th of 2014 by Balcevic and Seltra, again, really odd names, wage premiums and other benefits come directly from a union's size. Quote, we estimate that size of the union wage premium in our data by registering the plant level average wage on the plant level union share and then step by step adding further plant controls and fixed effects. The results are reported in Table 4 after controlling for the plant level input use. Skill shares and full set of industry interaction dummies. There is still an average union wage premium of 6.7%. Other things equal, the interpretation of the coefficient is that plant level average wages increased by almost 0.7% when the plant level union density increased with 10 percentage points. And again, that seems really, really dense and it's really scientific language, but the simple of it is, the long and short of it is, if the union is 10% larger, it's going to push up wages by 0.7%. And so you can mathematically discern how much a union is going to deliver in terms of benefits to its union members or even to people outside of the union in that industry by its size. Which means if right-to-work laws decrease the size of a union, it is going to decrease the benefits. So again, how much have unions actually declined though? That's sort of the answer, right? If we have this algebraic equation laid out in front of us, 10% larger, it's going to provide this benefit. What is the coefficient of the 10 percentage points? How much more have unions declined in size since their peak? And so according to a study done by the NBER, they find a difference of nearly 20% in the unionization rates between states with and without right-to-work laws. Right-to-work laws are also associated with a 7.5% lower wages. What that means is that in right-to-work states, you have 20% less membership. That is extremely dismal.
Yeah, and I think with these statistics on your side, like what Devin said, these huge numbers or very small numbers, this can really make for a very good offensive argument. I think that your opponents are going to have a really hard time defending their case or their side against something like this unless they've done quite a bit of homework themselves.
Right, like not only is it like a threefold argument because you've just been given all the benefits, You've given a mathematical equation in a research project, basically, from saying how it decreases and how it shows how much it's decreased. I mean, we can see the correlation here, and it's going to be very, very hard for the con to debunk this. And honestly, the only way they can debunk it that I can think of as of right now is freedom for workers. Now, again, we can get in that later, but there are going to be arguments that they can counteract this, but this is a solid argument that you should definitely use in your case.
Well, the con will have numbers of their own, so do be prepared for that. It's not like they have absolutely nothing to come back to this with, but it is very good.
So first, according to a study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research in August of 2022, if we're looking at some of the good evidence here, the researchers find that right-to-work laws are associated with a drop of about 4 percentage points in unionization rates 5 years after adoption, as well as a wage drop of about 1%. These impacts are almost entirely driven by 3 industries with high unionization rates at baseline: construction, education, and public administration, where right-to-work laws reduce unionization by about 13 percentage points and wages by about 4%. Again, over 5 years. The impact of right-to-work laws on wages and unionization rates is also larger for women and public sector workers, 2 groups that are overrepresented in highly unionized industries. A 4% decrease in wages over 5 years is a pretty big deal. Not only that, but consider the other benefits that employees miss out on from a 13% decrease in unionization. That's less health care, less time off, less leeway in terms of deciding your own schedule, not to mention those wages, which are extremely important.
Right, and I want to talk on this. Talk on that. It is a snowball effect with this argument. So batter this argument in. You know, make sure it's down pat. Make sure your math is right. Make sure your numbers flesh out. Because if you don't flesh this out, then a lot of your numbers, like Devin said earlier, are going to get a little murky. So make sure that your argument is correct here and that it is padded down, so that this argument, one that is very, very important, can then be substantial throughout the rest of the debate, because this is a snowball effect to healthcare, to education, to all these other things we're going to get to.
Well, I mean, I'd hope that all of your arguments are accurate, and I hope that you've done all of the math correct just by default, you know, not on this argument specifically. But yeah, like they both said, there are a lot of numbers in place. Make sure to keep track of them, but that should, I think, just go without saying, really.
Right. So let's go ahead and get into another argument that we're going to want to forward, which is worse health care and higher employment-related fatalities. In terms of health care, though, according to the EPI, on February 17th of 2011, the rate of employer-sponsored health care insurance is 2.6 percentage points lower in right-to-work states compared with non-right-to-work states. After controlling for individual job and state-level characteristics, if workers in non-right-to-work states were to receive ESI at this lower rate, 2 million fewer workers nationally would be covered. That means that if everybody in the nation had right-to-work laws, every state in the nation had right-to-work laws, 2 million people would not have health care at all. They would not have worker health care. They would not have employer-sponsored insurance. And that's extremely important, because that is, you know, literally the decision between life and death for a lot of people. If you have cancer or if you have some other debilitating illness, you might not be able to receive care for that chronic illness. If you are trying to figure out whether or not you have cancer or some other debilitating illness, you need to go see a doctor. And in a lot of cases, if you don't have health care, you're not going to want to go and do that. I would specifically hone in on that 2 million person number, especially in PF, when you're trying to be as hyperbolic as possible, and it's hard to do these things with the 7% and the 8% and the 0.6 percentage points. Here you have a concrete number, 2 million people, that's your impact. That's where you get up, that's maybe one of the trump cards, you know? And it's a little bit morbid, it's a little bit macabre, but we're going to try to focus on deaths. Because again, we can't calculate, okay, you know, construction is spending less on this safety equipment, maybe they don't need it. But we can know the direct result of a lack of safety, which is death or extreme injury. According to the Laborers' Health and Safety Fund of North America in August of 2016, they posted some numbers from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics and the United Health Foundation, and what they found was a major split between states that had right-to-work laws and those who did not. Quote, the effect on workers' wages is clear, but worker health and safety suffers too. The BLS reports that the rate of fatalities in the workplace is 54% higher in states with right-to-work laws. And again, yes, we can make some contrivances about, and we could poke holes in this and say, well, yeah, there's a difference between California and Mississippi. Maybe in terms of wages, maybe in terms of health care, maybe in terms of the economic output. I don't know that there's anything in the workplaces of Mississippi and not in the workplaces of California other than right-to-work laws that are going to cause 50% more fatalities in the workplace. That is an insane number. And again, another one of those trump cards. You know, not only do right-to-work laws hurt the wallet, but they can hurt employees themselves. This is a pretty profound impact that will definitely catch a judge's attention, I think, and it's going to be able to do a really huge deal for you in terms of winning the round.
So now we've gone over a couple of arguments. We've gone over that there are lower wages in right-to-work law states, and we've also gone over that there is going to be worse health care and higher workplace related fatalities as well. But now we are going to go over that there is going to be worse education. And the root cause of this is going to be that there's less investment in education from the state governments and from that of the entities that are funding education. A piece of evidence from the Labor Tribune states that when looking at the best and worst, most educated states, once again, right-to-work law states fail their residents, and in this case, their children. Splitting the nation into the 25 best and worst states, 76% of right-to-work law states fail their children, 19 of the 25 of them. And of the best 25 states, only 8, which is going to be 32%, are right-to-work law states. Tragically, Missouri ranks 31st overall, well into the worst grouping, while Illinois ranks 12th in the nation, high up in the best grouping.
Now, as a former Missouri resident, I find this absolutely appalling. I'm very offended. Well, no, just kidding. But seriously, if you look at that first paragraph of this card, you'll notice that it says phony, anti-worker, and the phrase so-called. It's clearly pretty biased, but it does have a lot of good numbers later on. And like I said in the very beginning of the video, it's a very polarizing issue, so just be careful which parts of cards that you actually read or include in your case, and make sure that it's objective as possible. Well, like Devin kind of hinted earlier in the video, I was the one who did basically all of the work on the con side of things. I'm not going to put my personal opinion out there, but I will try and give you the best advice possible to building a case on both sides. So the first thing, moving right into the con, is that you have to keep in mind that this is a negatively worded resolution, which means that on the negative, you're actually going to be advocating for right-to-work laws. So that is what this is all about. So don't let anyone get confused by that. And the path to victory should be pretty clear on the con. You have to find more reasons or just greater benefits to right-to-work laws than harms or reason against having them. And another potential path that you could take with this side of the resolution is to say that right-to-work laws do an equal amount of harm or good, or they do absolutely nothing at all. But that's a pretty complex argument to make, so I'm going to be breaking it down in a little bit more detail later. But first of all, let's just get right into that first negative argument, which is going to be union workers like right-to-work laws. So this evidence is from Forbes in 2019. Right-to-work laws increase worker satisfaction, especially among union workers. The study finds that the enactment of right-to-work law increased self-reported current life satisfaction, expected future life satisfaction, and sentiments about current and future economic activity among workers. Moreover, the effects were especially large among union workers. For example, the increase in economic sentiment caused by right-to-work law was nearly half the size of the increase in economic sentiment due to having a college degree. And according to the author, this suggests that the passage of right-to-work laws fundamentally raises the optimism that union workers have about their economic prospects. When workers don't have to pay dues to be union members in right-to-work states, they can use that extra money to buy other things without impacting their union status. Additionally, the idea of widespread free riding is dubious, since labor unions don't benefit all union members equally. Younger, healthier, and less experienced workers are often harmed by union agreements that can use experience as a basis for promotion or emphasize health and retirement benefits because of the cost of higher wages. And the article also goes on to say that workers in right-to-work states actually feel more like partners with their bosses rather than underlings, and that actually causes them to experience more satisfaction overall with their job as compared to workers in non-right-to-work states. And to be fair, the pro could preface this and explain it by pointing out the free rider problem, like I just mentioned, and I said I would talk about earlier, Here it goes. Now I'm going to break it down for you. The article actually mentions this argument, and as we saw, it tries to kind of preempt it by saying, no, it's not a free rider issue. It's the fact that younger, healthier, and less experienced workers actually get a worse deal from unions. And they're not just mindlessly free riding. They're not trying to scam their coworkers. No, they're actually coming up with a rational plan of how to get an appropriate amount of benefits for the correct amount of costs.
Right. And the only issue that I would say here for the pro is that, for one, you need to be thinking about what is in whose best interest. You know, is the idea of having the freedom to choose here more important than the wages that you would forego, or the health benefits that you would forego, or any of the other things that we mentioned in the pro case? You know, would any of those things be trumped by worker freedom? And also, not only that, but is there truly a sort of a resolution to the free rider problem? Because a union, yes, can go out and represent its own members in terms of health benefits, or in terms of wage increases, or in terms of bonuses and employment, but they cannot do that in terms of, you know, safety equipment, or other general ideas that have to apply to every single employee. You know, the union can't go and negotiate that only the union members wear hard hats on, you know, site, and then nobody else gets to have those, and they just get to be completely dangerous because of their own choosing. No, I mean, these things have to be general. And so there are still some things that overlap. There are still some things where people are, quote unquote, free riding on. So just keep that in mind on the pro.
Well, also another thing, and I'm not trying to start up a debate right now. We're trying to explain the articles or anything.
Yeah.
But those examples are really just kind of hypotheticals. I mean, if the pro does try and defend from an argument like that by saying basically what Devin just said, they're going to have to come up with some really specific examples, like some news stories, some examples of when people were hurt on the job because they didn't receive these union benefits or something like that. If they don't do that, as the con, you are the one with all the evidence and the statistics and the data in this case, and you can just push ahead and say, no, look, it gives them this economic flexibility and the ability to really decide what's in their contracts before they start working. And then you can explain the benefits that come from that a little bit later. That last argument I just covered was all about employee freedom and employee choice. And this argument is pretty similar. It's the right to work gives employees the choice without the sacrifice. So if we're talking about and around what right to work laws should actually do, I think that both sides should put employees and workers in the forefront and say that these laws are meant for them. It's supposed to make their lives better. It's supposed to make their lives easier. And the ability to choose to join a union or not is one aspect of freedom and personal choice in the workplace that you will get under right to work laws. So this article right here is from US News in 2012. I know it's a little bit dated, but the point still stands, so I'm going to get right into that. Right to work laws benefit both non-union and union workers as well as the unemployed. Without right to work, unions negotiate contractors requiring employers to fire employees who don't pay union dues. Employees must pay the union $500 to $1,000 a year or lose their job. Workers should have the right to unionize if they choose, but if workers don't support a union, the law shouldn't force them to pay dues. Right to work puts employees in the driver's seat. They pay only if they see value from the union's services. This accountability prevents unions from presuming workers' support. In the long run, right to work makes them more effective representatives. Unions respond by arguing that right to work allows non-union employees to, quote-unquote, freeload. They argue that the law shouldn't force them to represent employees who don't pay dues. It's a powerful argument, but it rests on a false premise. The National Labor Relations Act permits but doesn't mandate unions to represent every worker at a company. If unions do so, the law requires them to represent non-union employees fairly. However, as Justice William Brennan wrote half a century ago, members-only contracts have long been recognized by the Supreme Court. Unions voluntarily represent non-union workers. That hardly justifies forcing them to pay dues. So another thing you may notice in evidence like this is, again, like the concept of freeloading, which is an argument that your opponents on the pro are probably going to use a lot to try and undermine your arguments. But the way that you answer that is that union members will pay the dues if the union benefits them, and they'll be members if they can see a benefit to being a part of that union. And if they don't, they won't. And this is, again, all presuming that there are right to work laws in place in their state. So we'll probably be able to see logically good unions or unions that better represent their members succeed more under right to work laws, and we'll see those that don't kind of fade away or just completely cease to exist. And an analogy for this is kind of like how the free market works, where if you have a business that's doing well, more people are going to buy into it and invest in it, and then that business is going to get stronger and in turn be able to actually serve their buyers better. Whereas a business that doesn't do too well or doesn't have something that's attractive to people is not going to do as well and therefore going to kind of fade out of the picture and potentially close down.
I mean, one thing I would say as the pro is very simple. Even though we can make this sort of very clear, quote-unquote, free market, and again, yes, don't open it, it's a can of worms, but we can make these kinds of arguments about, yeah, if this is a good union, you can join it, and it will attract members on its own. We have to realize that there are a number of external pressures in terms of what is faced by a union in the real world. We can't just ignore the fact that there are going to be companies trying to attack unions. There are going to be companies trying to union bust. There are going to be states that are going to be giving a lot of power to people that have a lot of money and are going to be doing a lot of nefarious things, clear or unclear, to unions. And just keep that in mind as the pro, because it's really simple to put up this beautiful utopia where we can have the society where everybody makes the right and rational choice, and the right and rational choice is always taken. And if there's a good union, the best union will rise up in this free market. We could imagine that, but in all reality, it's very hopeful, to say the very least, and it's not very realistic. And you as the pro, when the neg gets up here and tries to make an argument like this, you need to kind of be like the neg. You need to throw that into a bit of chaos and say that's not the truth. Businesses always act against unions, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and I mean, it's kind of like a tragedy to the commons here, because what we have is, if I don't have to pay union dues to get all the benefits of the union, that's the free rider problem, of course. Everybody's going to go to that course because it's the course of least resistance. People don't have to pay money and get the benefits. However, if no money is in the fund for the union, these benefits are not achieved. Therefore, the union is not able to exercise their benefits like they would be able to if non-right to work is enabled. So the truth is that if we know that the union is able to have these benefits, if they have funds, then we need to make it so that the funds are going to go in the union.
So I know that we've been covering economic arguments pretty much throughout the entire video, and it's mostly been focused on wages and extra spending money and how much people are going to be paid. But this argument kind of comes in and takes a different look at that economic argument. So we're going to be talking about higher employment rates in right-to-work states. And this argument, I'm just going to say right off the bat, is a really great offensive argument because it's really going to attack the pro where they're the most confident. They're going to be the most confident about their economic data, and this is exactly what it addresses. And one thing that you're going to see is that while it might not be true in every single case, the difference in wages isn't actually as drastic as you think, according to the data. And not only that, but the best counter argument is that the best margins in terms of employment comes in when we're comparing right to work and non-right to work states. It's a pretty clear correlation. Now, I'm not going to say it's 100% causation, but it's a very clear correlation here. And we see a lot of data and a lot of really good work done by the McKennick Center for Public Policy, which we've linked here in the sources. And I'm not going to read all of it out because it's a lot of charts and it's a lot of data. But it looked at that data and it found that employment was much higher in industries like manufacturing and construction in right-to-work states as they compare to non-right-to-work states. And I would encourage you to read over, the entire study. It's full of really great data that could be helpful, especially on the con. There are a lot of good numbers that are going to really bolster your case and serve as some robust arguments here. And not only is it a really good offensive argument, because it could be a really good defensive tool as well. Because some people on the pro might argue about the importance of mandatory unions in blue-collar careers, like Devin and Tanner mentioned earlier about the hard hats issue, which again, I'm not sure if that's a real example, but let's imagine that it is, or they have something similar to that. The data shows that they're doing just fine in terms of not only employment, but also just their overall economics as a state.
Yeah, and I want to touch on something with that. Like if you're using this for the con, if more people are employed, that's going to lead more people out of poverty, which is good. We want to leave more people out of poverty. So this would definitely work for the con if you're just solely basing it off of the people that are employed and that we're leading more people out of poverty. So this is a very good argument for the con.
And that's true. Again, it comes back to sort of the framing issue about who we're talking about. If this is for consumers, this is fantastic, right? Because at the end of the day, higher employment pushes wages down. It makes makes for production is able to increase. It means that prices for you are going to go down as a consumer. So this is great for overall society. It lowers the bar for poverty, like Tanner said. But for the pro, if you're going to be weighing this on, in terms of the worker, you do need to watch out for that hole where wages are going to go down when employment rises. And so that's where you're going to get into this sort of an argument where the con's going to come up there and say that employment's great, and you're going to have to say that, yes, it is great to an extent. You can't have too tight of a labor market, and you need to make sure that there's some balance, so that way there can be some negotiation for higher wages, higher benefits, etc.
So moving on to the next argument, we have better real wages. Now, this is going to kind of contradict with what I just said about how we weigh statistics. But, that's just how it is. That's just how it goes sometimes. And you're going to have to be judicious about how you weigh things. But, I'm not saying this argument is any weaker or any stronger than the previous one. I know I've kind of been going on about how we weigh statistics, but I'll just get straight to the point. Real wages are basically what someone's wages are as compared to the cost of living. So we factor in all kinds of data about their just life in general and all kinds of environmental factors that go into that. And it's all adjusted. But when we're comparing right-to-work and non-right-to-work states, these right-to-work states actually have higher real wages. So like the pro might go up there and say something like, people in New York get paid more than people in Mississippi. Well, that may be true, but if we compare a right-to-work state and a non-right-to-work state, relative to their cost of living, someone in the right-to-work state is generally going to be paid more. And to back this up, this is from the Ethan Allen Institute, which, by the way, is not the clothing brand. They're a think tank. They say right-to-work opponents characterize right-to-work laws as the right to work for less. As Economic Policy Institute's Elise Gold puts it, workers in right-to-work states have lower wages. And while it is true that the dollar amount wages in right-to-work states tend to be lower, right-to-work states also have empathetically lower costs of living. In the second quarter of 2017, 21 of the 25 states with the lowest cost of living were right-to-work states. James Schreck, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, found that when the cost of living was taken into account, right-to-work laws are associated with 0.5% higher private sector wages. In other words, employees in right-to-work states savor higher purchasing power, or quote-unquote real incomes, than their peers in non-right-to-work states. As Robert Reed of the University of Oklahoma put it, right-to-work states have higher average wages that are significantly higher than non-right-to-work states. And this is another one of those more flexible arguments that you could use both offensively or defensively. So for example, you could use it as an offensive argument to just, say exactly what I just said and say, look, they're better off because their real wages are higher. And that could definitely be an attack against the pro. Or you could use it defensively. When the pro says something like the dollar amount wages are going to be higher, you can say, well, that may be true, but let's look at the real wages, which are far more accurate because we're, again, considering all of these environmental factors when we calculate what the real wage actually is.
Yeah, this argument right here is a great rebuttal for the lower wage argument that we made previously. If you knock the opponent right in the mouth, basically, with this rebuttal, this will definitely catch them off guard, and it'll make them very hard to rebuttal, because if you say that if you prepared that wages are lower, and then you come back and say, well, real wages are actually higher, that'll make the opponent very unsteady.
So our final argument coming in at the con is going to be right-to-work laws don't have any effects. Now, I know I said at the very beginning of the video that this is going to be very cut and dry, very straightforward, but this is a kind of creative curveball argument that you can throw at your opponent. And for a topic that's comparing benefits and harms, it's a really good way to basically shut down not just one argument, but potentially the entire pro case. Because the pro case, again, is going to be talking about these statistics and numbers that are supposedly empirically proven. But this evidence from the Congressional Research Service kind of gives a different perspective on this, which, by the way, it's another one of those things that I highly recommend you read the entire way through. It says repeatedly that there's no broad consensus on the economic impacts of right-to-work laws, or basically that there's just no economic impact big enough to catch anyone's real attention, other than these very biased sources that I mentioned earlier. So if we throw this at them as an argument saying, these impacts are either small or disputed or not big enough or statistically significant enough to prove, it's really going to put them on a defensive kind of attitude. Because after that, all you have to do is use an argument that basically just says that right to work gives employees choice or something like that I mentioned earlier, something really minor that, you know, doesn't have a huge effect on the economy or employment or benefits or something like that, but is provable nonetheless and still can prove to your judge, hey, if you pass these laws, it's going to be benefiting real people. But again, you know, this is really just a huge defensive argument. Do you guys have anything to say about that?
I mean, the only thing I would say is for the pro, and this is what I hate the most about this kind of a cut and dry evidentiary battle, is when you have conflicting pieces of evidence. What will happen is that those evidences of course, are typically going to say like literally the exact opposite of each other, and especially with an argument like this that was just presented by Luke, talking about how the evidence is inconclusive or we can't, you know, draw this sort of causatory relationship. You are going to have to start to argue about methodology. You're going to have to get up there and start saying, well, our experiment was able to adjust for this variable, or was able to knock out that variable, or was able to narrow down on this variable, and thus we can prove some sort of causation. And it's going to get really drawn out, and it's going to get really boring, and it's going to be borderline ridiculous. So I'm just saying, prepare yourself for that when you quote a study. Just write off to the side, or maybe even in a block file. Note, what was the methodology? How tight was it? Were we just comparing statistics between Arizona and New Mexico? Or are we saying in this state, before and after, adjusting for this X variable, X variable, X variable, you know, this is the case, and thus we can, with confidence, within a certain confidence interval, if you know any statistics, this is the causation factor of, you know, right to work laws on a reduction in benefits or whatever.
But again, most of the sources on this say that there is no causal effect when you're looking at the more neutral sources. But if you're looking at the politicized sources, because this is a very heavily politicized issue, they're going to say that it has a massive causal effect either one way or another.
And hey, you know, you could run the nuclear option for both, or well, actually only for the con, and just say the literature's inconclusive. We don't know anything, so you can't vote for the pro. You have to vote for the neg. And I mean, I wouldn't run the argument, but if you were to find evidence like that, and there's plenty of it out there that just says, we don't know if there's a causal factor. We've done all the robustness checks and all the confidence interval checks. We don't know. We don't have any clue. But that being said, I think that kind of cuts it out for both the pro and the con side. So let's go ahead and jump right into the final thoughts. So, you know, now that we've covered pretty much everything in the argument, I think we can go ahead and jump into our final thoughts. Why don't you start us off, Luke?
Well, I mean, as I said in the very beginning of the video, this is a very straightforward topic. You're probably going to be focusing on one of three things. You're going to be focusing either on the political and social impacts of these laws, you're going to be focusing on the economy, or you're going to be focusing on worker freedom. Regardless of what side you're on, I mean, you can pick and choose depending on how you build your case. But I really think that you will have to be smart about how you build your case to make sure that none of your numbers contradict or are just like easy targets for the other side. And I think that the winner overall of most of these rounds, it's going to be whoever has the better grasp of what right-to-work laws are and how they actually work. It's really just going to be a knowledge-based decision. I think who can set up the best picture for the judge, the clearest story with the best details. And what do you think, Tanner?
Yeah, so I mean, going off of what you just said, I mean, you got to understand your arguments in order to make this case. Because, again, I mean, we said it was straightforward res, which it is, but in order to make your contentions, and in order to make your arguments, you have to know your evidence, you have to know your side well. And if you have to do that, then you have to know in rebuttals. You can't just be frantically making up these numbers, and you have to prepare this stuff. Like the example of the con giving real wages over that of the pros just wages, period. A great rebuttal is given when it says the real wages, but you have to be prepared for that stuff. So just make sure to do your research and to understand your topic in and out. Regarding the harms and benefits, there's going to be a lot of things going into weight, the weight of each argument. And I mean, we alluded to this on the curveball argument, which is none of them have any weight. But we need to add weight, if there is, to any benefit or harm that was given in each side. So if you are on the pro or on the con, make sure to add pounds to your arguments and make the judge know that this is a vote-worthy topic, and that if you just go by worst education or worst healthcare or whatever, make sure that that's going to be heavy, so that they understand that this is a ballot deciding issue, that this is something that they should be considering. So just don't say it and then keep going. Make sure you make the judge know that this is very important and that this argument has weight. But overall, this is a pretty straightforward res that if you add weight and you know your topics and you can do your rebuttals, you will probably do pretty good. What about you, Devin?
Well, you know, I think like both of us, in fact, I think all of us have concluded this is a very simple topic. I think it's a little bit more cut and dry. I think it's a little bit more simple than all of that. I don't know that this is going to revolve so much around the story that you tell. Sure, you're going to want to, drop some names and put some relevant numbers in there, like we mentioned earlier with the 2 million people that might be cut out of healthcare if right to work was extended nationwide. But this is going to come down to, in my opinion, an evidentiary battle. This is going to come down to a really boring, really long and drawn out war about, whose methodology is the most accurate, whose confidence variable is, the strongest, whose evidence is going to really be the most encompassing or even the most narrow in a lot of the cases where we want to draw a strong causal link between right to work laws and wage increases or decreases depending on what side you're on. So this comes down to just playing it simple, playing it conservative, making strong arguments, and most of all, finding strong, narrow, and relevant evidence and putting it in your case. Don't drop a bunch of, BS in there. Just make sure, very simple, that this is not a bunch of baloney. Make it as tight and as secure as you possibly can. So that being said, I think that we've covered a lot of this topic, and hopefully we've given you a lot of help. So remember, debate is for everybody.
Work hard.
Have fun.
And
Hail State.